Dr. Sarah Chen pulled into the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before her shift began. The massive building loomed against the gray morning sky like a sleeping giant. She had worked here for 6 years, but, lately, something felt different. Wrong. The automatic doors whispered open as she approached. The lobby was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of machines from upper floors. Even the usually bustling emergency department seemed unusually calm. "Morning, Dr. Chen," called out Marcus, the night security guard. His voice echoed in the empty space. "Morning, Marcus. Quiet night?" Marcus nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Too quiet, if you ask me. We've had 3 patients transferred out in the last week. All of them, well, they didn't make it to their destination." Sarah paused at the elevator, her key card hovering over the scanner. "What do you mean, they didn't make it?" "Transport accidents. All 3 of them. Different ambulance companies, different routes. But all 3 were patients from the same wing." Marcus lowered his voice. "Ward 7. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Sarah stepped inside, but Marcus's words followed her like a cold wind. Ward 7 was her ward. The cardiac intensive care unit where she had built her reputation as one of the hospital's most skilled doctors. As the elevator climbed to the 7th floor, Sarah's mind raced. She had noticed the unusual number of transfers lately, but she hadn't connected them. Patients being moved to other facilities wasn't uncommon, especially when specialized care was needed elsewhere. But transport accidents were rare. 3 in 1 week from the same ward was more than suspicious. The elevator doors opened to reveal the familiar sight of Ward 7. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with patient rooms and monitoring stations. The nursing station sat in the center like a command post, its computers glowing softly in the dim lighting. "Dr. Chen." Nurse Janet Williams looked up from her charts. "Thank goodness you're here. We need to talk." Janet had been working Ward 7 for 15 years. Nothing rattled her anymore, which made the worry lines on her face all the more concerning. She motioned for Sarah to follow her to a quiet corner near the supply closet. "Something's not right," Janet whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "The patients we've been transferring. I've been calling the receiving hospitals to check on them. None of them ever arrived." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, they never arrived?" "I mean the ambulances never showed up at their destinations. When I called to follow up on Mrs. Patterson yesterday, the hospital said they never received any transfer request. They had no record of her coming. Maybe there was a communication error. Paperwork gets mixed up all the time." Janet shook her head firmly. "I've checked 3 times. Mr. Rodriguez, Mrs. Patterson, and Mr. Kim. All 3 were supposed to go to different hospitals for different procedures. None of them arrived. And, when I tried to track down the ambulance companies..." She paused, her voice dropping even lower. "The companies don't exist." Sarah's mouth went dry. "That's impossible. The transfers were authorized by Dr. Whitmore himself. Dr. Richard Whitmore was the chief of cardiology and Sarah's supervisor. He had worked at Mercy General for over 20 years and was respected throughout the medical community. The idea that he might be involved in something suspicious seemed absurd. "I know how it sounds," Janet continued. "But I've been a nurse long enough to know when something stinks. And this whole situation reeks." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Dr. Whitmore himself was walking down the hallway, his white coat pristine and his expression unreadable. "Dr. Chen, Nurse Williams. Early morning consultation?" Sarah forced a smile. "Just discussing the patient roster for today." Dr. Whitmore nodded, but his eyes seemed to linger on them a moment too long. "Good. We have another transfer coming up this afternoon. Room 712. Mr. Franklin needs specialized cardiac surgery that we can't provide here." Sarah knew Mr. Franklin. He was a 67-year-old retired teacher who had come in with chest pain 3 days ago. His condition had been stable, and she had been planning to discharge him later in the week. "Sir, Mr. Franklin's EKGs have been normal for the past 48 hours. His enzyme levels are back to baseline. I'm not sure he needs surgery at all." Dr. Whitmore's expression hardened slightly. "The decision has been made, Dr. Chen. The ambulance will arrive at 3 p.m. Please have his discharge paperwork ready." As Dr. Whitmore walked away, Sarah and Janet exchanged worried glances. Something was definitely wrong, and it was getting worse. The morning passed slowly. Sarah tried to focus on her rounds, but her mind kept returning to the 3 missing patients. She found herself paying closer attention to every detail, looking for clues that might explain what was happening. Around noon, she decided to do something that could get her into serious trouble. She logged into the hospital's computer system and began searching for records of the transferred patients. What she found made her stomach sink. According to the official records, all 3 patients had died during transport due to complications from their conditions. Death certificates had been filed, and their families had been notified. But if Janet was right and the ambulance companies didn't exist, then what had really happened to these people? Sarah printed copies of the files and slipped them into her lab coat pocket. She needed more information, but she also needed to be careful. If someone was covering up what had happened to those patients, they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. As she walked past room 712, she saw Mr. Franklin sitting up in bed, reading a magazine. He looked healthy, alert, and completely unaware that in 3 hours, he was scheduled to disappear forever. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She walked into Mr. Franklin's room and closed the door behind her. "Mr. Franklin, I need to ask you something important. Has anyone discussed transferring you to another hospital?" The elderly man looked confused. "Transfer? No, doctor. Dr. Whitmore said I might be able to go home tomorrow. Why would I need a transfer?" Sarah's blood ran cold. Dr. Whitmore had lied to her about the transfer being necessary for specialized surgery. But if Mr. Franklin wasn't sick enough to need surgery, why was he being transferred at all? She spent the next 2 hours researching everything she could find about the missing patients. What she discovered painted a terrifying picture. All 3 had one thing in common besides being on Ward 7, they were all alone in the world. No close family, few friends, and minimal social connections. They were perfect targets for someone who wanted people to disappear without anyone asking too many questions. As 3 p.m. approached, Sarah knew she had to act. She couldn't let Mr. Franklin become the 4th victim, whatever was happening to these patients. But she also couldn't confront Dr. Whitmore directly without more proof. She called Janet to her office and showed her what she had discovered. The nurse's face went pale as she read through the files. "We have to call the police," Janet whispered. "With what evidence? Everything looks legitimate on paper. We need to catch them in the act." "Them?" Sarah looked toward the hallway, where Dr. Whitmore could be seen talking quietly with 2 men in dark suits. They didn't look like medical personnel. "I don't think Dr. Whitmore is working alone." As they watched, one of the men handed Dr. Whitmore an envelope. Money was changing hands, and it wasn't for medical services. At exactly 3 p.m., the fake ambulance would arrive for Mr. Franklin. Sarah had to decide, stay silent and let another patient disappear, or risk everything to expose the truth. She looked at Janet, took a deep breath, and made the choice that would either save lives or destroy her career. "We're going to follow that ambulance." Sarah and Janet watched from the supply closet window as a white ambulance pulled up to the hospital's back entrance at exactly 3 p.m. 2 men in paramedic uniforms got out, but something about them was wrong. Their uniforms were clean, too clean for people who had been working all day. Their movements were too careful, too practiced. "Those aren't real paramedics," Janet whispered. Sarah had parked her car in the back lot earlier, positioning it where they could follow the ambulance without being seen. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, knowing they were about to step into something far more dangerous than a medical mystery. They watched as Dr. Whitmore personally escorted the fake paramedics to Mr. Franklin's room. Through the glass partition, they could see the elderly man's confused expression as he was told about the sudden transfer. He pointed to his chest, probably asking why he needed surgery when he felt fine. Dr. Whitmore said something that made Mr. Franklin nod reluctantly. Within minutes, he was being wheeled out on a gurney, still looking confused but trusting the doctors who were supposed to care for him. "Here they come," Sarah said, starting her car. "Stay low." The ambulance pulled away from the hospital with no sirens, no flashing lights. Just a quiet, routine transfer that would never be questioned by anyone who saw it. Sarah followed at a distance, her heart pounding as they drove through the city streets. Instead of heading toward any of the major hospitals in the area, the ambulance turned onto a highway leading out of the city. They drove for nearly an hour, passing through small towns and rural farmland. Sarah had to drop back even further to avoid being spotted on the empty roads. "Where are they taking him?" Janet asked, her voice barely audible. The ambulance finally turned off the main highway onto a dirt road that led deep into the woods. Sarah parked at the highway and they continued on foot, following the fresh tire tracks in the mud. The sound of the ambulance had faded into the distance, but they could see its lights through the trees ahead. What they found when they reached the clearing made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't a medical facility. It was a compound surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Several buildings were scattered around the property, including what looked like a medical facility, but also structures that resembled warehouses and laboratories. "What is this place?" Janet breathed. Through binoculars that Sarah had grabbed from her emergency kit, they watched as Mr. Franklin was wheeled into the main building. He was still conscious, still looking around in confusion. But something told Sarah that he wouldn't be conscious much longer. They circled the compound, staying hidden in the tree line. What they saw made them both sick to their stomachs. There were other ambulances parked behind the buildings, all with different company names, all fake. And there were people in lab coats moving between the buildings, carrying equipment that looked more suited to research than patient care. "It's not a hospital," Sarah whispered. "It's some kind of research facility." As they watched, a black sedan pulled up to the main gate. 3 men in expensive suits got out and were escorted inside by armed guards. These weren't medical personnel or patients. They looked like buyers. "We need to get closer," Sarah said. "We need proof of what's happening here." They made their way to the back of the compound, where the security seemed lighter. A small window in one of the buildings was partially open, and they could hear voices inside. Sarah boosted Janet up to look through the window. What Janet saw made her cover her mouth to keep from screaming. Mr. Franklin was lying on an operating table, unconscious. But the people around him weren't performing surgery to save his life. They were harvesting his organs. "They're killing him," Janet whispered when she dropped back down. "They're taking everything. Heart, liver, kidneys, everything." Sarah felt sick, but she also felt a burning anger. These people were murdering innocent patients for their organs, selling them to the highest bidder. And Dr. Whitmore, a man she had trusted and respected, was helping them do it. They had to get proof, but they also had to survive long enough to get that proof to the authorities. Sarah used her phone to record everything they could see and hear from their hiding spot. The voices inside were discussing prices, delivery schedules, and which organs were in highest demand. "The heart goes to the facility in Miami," one voice said. "They're paying top dollar for type O negative." "What about the liver?" "Private client in Europe. $500,000 for a perfect match." Sarah's phone captured it all, but she knew recordings alone wouldn't be enough. They needed physical evidence, documentation that would convince the police and the FBI that this wasn't just an elaborate hoax. As they prepared to leave and call the authorities, they heard footsteps approaching their hiding spot. A security guard with a flashlight was making his rounds, and he was heading straight for them. Sarah grabbed Janet's hand and they ran, crashing through the underbrush as quietly as they could manage. Behind them, they could hear shouting and the sound of more guards joining the search. They made it back to Sarah's car just as vehicles from the compound were spreading out to search the area. Sarah drove without headlights until they reached the main highway, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We have to call the police," Janet said, pulling out her phone. "Wait." Sarah's mind was racing. If Dr. Whitmore is involved, he might have connections with local law enforcement. "We need to be smart about this." They drove to Sarah's apartment, where she immediately began uploading the videos to multiple cloud storage accounts and emailing copies to herself at different addresses. If something happened to them, at least there would be a record of what they had discovered. But, as they worked, Sarah realized they had a bigger problem. Tomorrow morning, she was expected to be at work as usual. Dr. Whitmore would be watching her, looking for any sign that she knew what was happening. And there would probably be another patient scheduled for transfer. "We can't go back to the hospital," Janet said. "It's too dangerous. We have to. If we disappear now, Dr. Whitmore will know we're onto him. He'll move the operation somewhere else, and more people will die." Sarah spent the rest of the night developing a plan. They would return to work and act normal while secretly gathering more evidence. But they would also set up a dead man switch. If anything happened to them, the evidence would automatically be sent to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the country. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital at her usual time. Dr. Whitmore was waiting for her at the nurse's station, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Chen, I heard you had some concerns about yesterday's transfer." Sarah forced herself to stay calm. "Just following up on patient care, sir. Making sure everything went smoothly. Mr. Franklin is doing well. The surgery was successful." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Mr. Franklin was dead, his organs sold to the highest bidders. But Sarah couldn't let Dr. Whitmore know that she knew. "I'm glad to hear it. Will we be able to follow up with him?" Dr. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. Patient confidentiality, you understand." As the day progressed, Sarah noticed that she was being watched. Security guards who usually stayed in the lobby were now patrolling the 7th floor. Nurses she didn't recognize were asking casual questions about her work and her schedule. Around noon, Dr. Whitmore called her into his office. "Dr. Chen, I'm concerned about your recent behavior. You seem stressed, distracted. Perhaps you need some time off." "I feel fine, sir. I'm afraid I must insist. You're to take administrative leave effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Sarah's heart sank. They had figured out that she was suspicious, and now they were removing her from the equation. But, as she was escorted from the building, she managed to send a text message to Janet, "Execute the plan now." Janet received the message while she was working her shift. She immediately went to the computer and began downloading every file she could access related to patient transfers and Dr. Whitmore's activities. She copied everything to a flash drive and prepared to leave the hospital. But, as she headed for the exit, 2 security guards blocked her path. "Nurse Williams, Dr. Whitmore would like to see you." Janet knew she was trapped, but she also knew that Sarah was counting on her. The evidence they had gathered was their only hope of stopping the killings and bringing the murderers to justice. As she was escorted to Dr. Whitmore's office, Janet made a decision that would either save countless lives or cost her everything. She activated the dead man switch. The dead man switch activated at exactly 6 p.m., just as Sarah and Janet had planned. Across the country, emails containing video evidence, audio recordings, and detailed documentation began flooding the inboxes of FBI field offices, state police departments, medical licensing boards, and investigative journalists. Janet never made it to Dr. Whitmore's office. As she was being escorted through the hospital corridors, FBI agents were already mobilizing based on an anonymous tip that had been automatically generated by Sarah's system. The timing was perfect. The agents arrived just as Janet was about to disappear like the other victims. "FBI. Nobody move. The hospital erupted into chaos. Security guards who had been part of the organ harvesting operation tried to run, but the building was already surrounded. Dr. Whitmore was found in his office, frantically shredding documents and wiping computer hard drives. Agent Maria Santos had been investigating reports of missing persons in the area for months. The evidence that suddenly appeared in her inbox painted a picture so horrific that she initially thought it was an elaborate hoax. But the videos were too detailed, too real to be fake. "Get me everything on Mercy General Hospital," she told her team. "Every employee, every patient transfer, every financial record. And I want a team at these coordinates immediately." She pointed to the location of the compound that Sarah and Janet had discovered. Sarah watched the news coverage from her apartment, knowing she couldn't return to the hospital until the FBI gave her the all-clear. Her phone rang constantly as reporters tried to reach her for comments, but she ignored them all. The evidence would speak for itself. At the compound in the woods, FBI agents made discoveries that shocked even seasoned investigators. The facility had been operating for over 5 years, murdering vulnerable patients and selling their organs on the black market. They found refrigerated storage units containing organs ready for shipment, surgical suites designed for harvesting rather than healing, and records showing payments totaling millions of dollars. But the most horrific discovery was in the basement, a crematorium used to dispose of the victims' remains after their organs had been harvested. Forensic teams would eventually identify the remains of over 30 people, all of whom had been reported as dying during routine medical transports. Dr. Whitmore was just the beginning. As FBI agents traced the money trail, they discovered a network that included hospital administrators, ambulance company owners, organ brokers, and even some patients' family members who had been paid to sign false death certificates. The buyers were equally disturbing: wealthy individuals who could afford to skip organ waiting lists, private hospitals that didn't ask too many questions about where their organs came from, and international medical facilities that specialized in transplants for clients who could pay premium prices. Within 72 hours of the raids, 43 people had been arrested across 7 states. The scope of the operation was staggering. Hospitals in 3 states had been feeding patients to the organ harvesting network, targeting people who were alone, elderly, or unlikely to be missed. Sarah returned to Mercy General a week later, but the hospital she had known was gone. Half the staff had been arrested or suspended pending investigation. The remaining employees walked the halls like ghosts, wondering how they had worked alongside murderers without knowing it. The hospital administration had been completely restructured. New oversight protocols were put in place to prevent any patient from being transferred without multiple approvals and verification of receiving facilities. Security cameras were installed in every corridor, and all patient transfers now required family notification, regardless of the patient's circumstances. Janet was hailed as a hero, but she struggled with the knowledge of how many patients had died before they were able to stop the operation. She took early retirement and moved to another state, unable to continue working in the place where so many innocent people had been betrayed by those sworn to protect them. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Patterson," she told Sarah during their last conversation. "She was so scared when they came for her. She kept asking me if she would be okay, and I told her she would be. I told her to trust the doctors." Sarah understood the guilt, because she felt it too. As a physician, her first duty was to do no harm. But she had worked alongside Dr. Whitmore for years without suspecting that he was systematically murdering patients under her nose. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Dr. Whitmore and 12 other defendants were eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The organ brokers and buyers received sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years. Several international arrest warrants were issued for buyers who had fled the country. Mercy General Hospital faced hundreds of lawsuits from families who discovered that their loved ones had been murdered rather than dying from natural causes. The hospital's insurance companies paid out over $200 million in settlements, and the facility was eventually sold to a national healthcare chain that spent millions rebuilding both the physical structure and the institution's reputation. Sarah testified in front of a congressional committee investigating organ trafficking in the United States. Her testimony led to new federal legislation requiring strict oversight of all organ transplant activities and mandatory reporting of suspicious patient transfers. The system failed because people like me didn't ask enough questions, she told the committee. We trusted colleagues we had worked with for years. We assumed that if someone wore a white coat and had medical credentials, they were committed to saving lives, not taking them. But Sarah also discovered something unexpected during the investigation. She wasn't the only healthcare worker who had noticed suspicious patterns. Across the country, nurses and doctors had reported concerns about unusual patient transfers and missing patients to their supervisors, only to be told to mind their own business or face disciplinary action. The organ harvesting network had been protected by a culture of medical hierarchy that discouraged questioning authority figures. Nurses who raised concerns were transferred to other departments or fired. Junior doctors who asked too many questions found their career advancement blocked. The silence wasn't accidental, Sarah realized. It was enforced. A year after the arrests, Sarah received a call that she had been dreading. Another suspicious patient transfer had been reported at a hospital 3 states away. Despite all the new laws and oversight procedures, someone was trying to restart the operation. She immediately contacted Agent Santos, who had become the FBI's leading expert on medical organ trafficking. Together, they began investigating what appeared to be a copycat operation that had learned from the mistakes of the Mercy General Network. They're more careful this time, Agent Santos explained during their meeting. Smaller operations, more scattered locations, better cover stories. But the basic model is the same: target vulnerable patients and sell their organs to the highest bidder. Sarah realized that stopping one network hadn't solved the problem. The demand for black market organs was too high, and the profits too enormous. As long as there were desperate patients willing to pay any price for a transplant, and vulnerable people who could be exploited, the trade would continue. She made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She left clinical medicine to work full-time with the FBI's Medical Crimes Unit. Her job was to train healthcare workers to recognize the signs of organ trafficking and to investigate reports of suspicious medical activities. I can save more lives this way, she explained to her former colleagues. Every network we shut down prevents dozens of murders. 3 years later, Sarah's work had helped expose 6 more organ trafficking operations across the United States and Canada. The networks were becoming smaller and more cautious, but they were also becoming easier to identify for those who knew what to look for. Mercy General Hospital had been rebuilt and reopened under new management, with Sarah's former office converted into a memorial garden for the victims of the organ trafficking network. A plaque near the entrance bore the names of the 37 people who had died, along with a simple message: they trusted us with their lives. We must never forget them. On quiet evenings, Sarah sometimes drove past the hospital where her old life had ended and her new purpose had begun. The building looked peaceful in the darkness, its windows glowing with warm light as doctors and nurses worked to save lives rather than take them. But she knew that somewhere, in another hospital in another city, someone might be making the same choice that Dr. Whitmore had made years ago, deciding that money was more important than the sacred trust between doctor and patient. Her phone was always ready to ring with news of another investigation, another network to infiltrate, another group of vulnerable people who needed protection from those who saw them not as human beings deserving of care, but as commodities to be harvested and sold. The hospital stays quiet now, but Sarah never stops listening for the secrets that kill. And she never stops fighting to make sure that the silence is broken before more innocent people disappear into the darkness, never to be seen again.